Yeah, well, before I was a politician, I was a public school teacher. I taught
That helps.
grade language arts on the west side of San Antonio. And I often say that teaching middle school is the best preparation for serving in the Texas legislature. There's a lot of
Wow.
overlap between those two jobs. But, my students are the reason I ran for office. I taught in one of the poorest zip codes in the state of Texas, and I saw firsthand what happens when you underfund neighborhood public
Mm.
schools. I saw kids slip through the cracks. I saw teachers working a second job to make ends meet, and that made me mad. And it's why I ran for this position to make sure that we had educators helping to make these decisions at the state capitol. And I think this private school voucher scam that Greg Abbott is pushing is an existential threat to public education in this state and in this country. And I think in every state that's tried these vouchers, it drains billions of dollars from our underfunded schools and then gives that money to wealthy parents who are
Mm.
already sending their kids to private school. That's why I call it a scam, because it's stealing from working class people and giving our tax dollars to the wealthiest families in this state. And as you mentioned, my faith is the most important thing in my life. My granddad was a Baptist preacher. I grew up at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church here in Austin, where my pastor drew upon, the likes of Dr. King and Howard Thurman and Alice Walker,
Mm.
and I think that perspective and that kind of theology, really inspires me to fight for the poor and the disenfranchised, which is what we're called to do as Christians.
Mm. Unfortunately, not all of us remember that calling. For me, this connection between school vouchers and this rise that we're seeing in white Christian nationalism, it is so they're partners hand in hand. And my audience knows we've talked extensively about how after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, that basically the Supreme Court says that separate but equal, one, it wasn't equal, but two, it was unconstitutional. What we saw in response to that was a huge backlash from white Americans. And many of them, yes, across the South, but even it was not geographic specific, instead of having integrated education, chose to instead close down their schools entirely in some cases and reopen private religious schools that were housed within their church apparatus that would allow them to essentially be as discriminatory as they wished to be. And those folks who were leading that effort also wanted to take the dollars that were previously funding their public schools and have them reallocated to their now religious and frankly racist private schools. And it feels to me like we're seeing much the same thing. Whether or not the race element is there, it might be up for debate. I think it is, but certainly the class reality is there because, as you said, this feels like an effort to take money from poor people, the public coffers, and give it to wealthy people who, frankly, as I understand it, already have their children enrolled in these schools, so they're already paying for it. Why would they need a voucher? Do you see these connections or the same or somewhat differently?
No, I see it exactly the same way. And, the first voucher bill was proposed here in the Texas Capitol in 1957, which was just 3 years
Whoa.
after the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down from the Supreme Court. I mean, that first voucher bill was a deliberate attempt to resegregate schools. It was to
Mm.
allow white parents to take their kids out of newly integrated public schools and send them to white-only private schools. So these vouchers have a dark history, and it's why we should be particularly outraged that the billionaires who are pushing these voucher scams oftentimes will use students of color on their mailers and on their TV ads as a way of, saying that it's going to give opportunity to kids who are in struggling schools, when that's the exact opposite of what these vouchers do. It's often called school choice, but it's actually the school's choice, because private schools can deny admission to any kid for virtually any reason they want. I mean, they
Wow.
can deny admission because of your academics, because of your behavior,
Mm-hmm.
because you're not the right cultural fit. And so what ends up happening is that, black and brown students, poor and working class kids, they get denied admission. But the parents who are already sending their kids to private school, they're eligible for this program too, because it's universal. And so they're going to get a $10,000 discount on their tuition bill at the expense of my students on the west side of San Antonio or students in the third ward of Houston. And so this is why I call vouchers welfare for the wealthy. And if it passes in Texas, it'll be a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. And it's why we
Mm.
need folks from all over the state calling their legislators and demanding that they reject this scam and fully fund our public schools.
How is this being messaged on the ground? In my brain, which admittedly stays focused on these things intently, this is an easy conversation to have. If we could just get all the people that we need to have the conversation in the same room. How is this playing out on the ground? What are you hearing from other Texans? Is there a groundswell of recognition as to the truth of what you're saying? Or are you seeing more of a, oh, I didn't even know we were having this debate right now kind of approach?
Normally state issues don't get a lot of coverage. You're having me on to your program, but a lot of news programs and media outlets don't have state legislators on. They're focused on what's happening nationally. But this issue is breaking through. And, we had a historic number of people show up to give public testimony on this bill 2 weeks ago. And it was 70% against vouchers, 30%
Wow.
for. And what's even more surprising is that it was bipartisan. It was Democrats and Republicans standing together to reject this scam. And that's true in the Texas House in the lower chamber. Greg Abbott tried to pass this voucher scam in 2023, but a bipartisan coalition of urban and suburban Democrats, along with rural small town Republicans, stood together and defeated that scam on the floor of the House. We still have that bipartisan coalition. We just got to make sure that it stands together and tries to defeat this voucher again this time around. Because, we've talked about how this will hurt students of color and students in our urban cores. But remember that this also will hollow out rural communities across the state that depend on their public schools. In a lot of these small
Right.
towns in Texas, the public school is the last pillar holding up that community because the local businesses left, the churches are on the decline, the local hospital is closed. So the school is the last thing holding these communities together. And if vouchers passes, it'll decimate these rural communities. So there is a coalition here that we've got to hold together if we're going to stop this bill.
I want to shift, if we could, just a bit to focusing more on the religious aspect, because what you just said actually gave me a little bit of hope. And one of the reasons I definitely see vouchers as a national issue, even though it's playing out at the state levels, because we've looked at what's happening in other states, and it feels like everywhere that we have seen vouchers take off, it has been a financial disaster. I want to say, is it Arizona or Arkansas? I
Right.
can't remember which,
Oh,
but they yeah, both. Pick one.
yeah.
But they have essentially bankrupted their public education
Arizona.
system if and are soon to do it if they have not yet reached that final number, because these are scams. They don't work. And in order to, once you have implemented a program and it doesn't work, the ability to fight to have it removed or revoked is extraordinarily difficult. So from my vantage point, we have a national platform here. We have to nationalize these issues because, as I often say, what happens in the Confederacy does not stay in the Confederacy. But I want to shift. I know we have just a moment or two left. I want to focus more on the religious side of this conversation. I am increasingly concerned about the rise in white Christian nationalism, the Seven Mountains mandates, it being a part of that, and this real resurgence that we're seeing in the type of racism that justified slavery, that allowed the church to be a willing participant in the slave system, and in the genociding of indigenous people. And it feels like we're not making America great, definitely not again, but it feels like we are reviving all of the elements that went into making white Christian nationalism one of the most dominant and, I would say, most terroristic religious platforms in the world. What are you seeing in terms of your vantage point? You are there, you're on the ground, you're seeing what's happening. How is this white Christian nationalism resurgence landing for you?
And I just want to make one comment. You were saying that it's bankrupting the Arizona education system, which is true. And I just want to say that because that's the goal. The billionaires that are pushing vouchers, their
Ah,
goal is to dismantle public education. And so I don't want
right.
us to miss that ultimate vision that they're working toward. And a
Mm.
lot of the billionaires who are pushing this are Christian nationalists. So Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilks are two uh, oil and gas billionaires from West Texas who are increasingly controlling our state government. They are also Christian nationalist pastors. Your viewers are probably wondering how you can be a billionaire and a pastor at the same time, but these two
It's
guys,
America.
that's right. They seem to do it, and they don't preach a theology of universal love like the kind many of us were brought up with, like the kind many of your viewers are familiar with. They preach a theology of power, control, domination. And that is where this toxic theology comes from. And Betsy DeVos, who is a Michigan billionaire, former Secretary of Education, she's also funding this voucher scam here in Texas. And she says it's to advance God's kingdom. Those are her own
Wow.
words. And again, when I read my Bible, I know that God's kingdom is for the poor. And this bill actively steals from the poor to give to the rich, which is the opposite of what Jesus asked us to do. So my point is, every person who's listening to this program needs to understand that there is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. It is a perversion of a beautiful faith tradition that inspired the likes of Dr. King and Cesar Chavez. And they're using our faith to accumulate wealth and power for themselves. This is not about following Jesus, it's about pursuing power. And that has been true throughout history, right? Whether it was Bull Connor, whether it was Adolf Hitler, all of these folks used Christianity to accumulate wealth and power for themselves, whether it's economic power, political power, or social power. And so I define Christian nationalism as the worship of power in the name of Christ, because that's really the idol that Christian nationalists worship. It is this power that they are pursuing with such ruthless efficiency. And so it is incumbent upon Christians in particular to speak out against this perversion of our faith and this subversion of our democracy.
Mm. We have a lot of work to do, and I really wish this were not a national issue. I really do. I really wish this were some small, low level issue that was being easily dismantled. But those names you dropped, those billionaires, they are powered by a lot. It is not the anointing or the power of the Holy Ghost, but they are powered by a lot of wealth and resources. And that means the people power is going to have to matter that much more. For the people in the state of Texas, is there a specific number that they can call to get access to their representatives when it comes to this voucher issue, or do they have to contact their specific representative directly?
You can call the State House of Representatives and tell them where you live, and they will direct you to your state rep and your state senator. But I will also plug a website. It's called don'tdefundmyschool.com.
Mm.
Don'tdefundmyschool.com. And what's cool about that website, if your viewers go on there, they can type in their local school district, and it'll show you how much vouchers will drain from your local school district. And
Wow.
then it gives you instructions on how you can call your representatives and demand that they reject the scam. So I would encourage anyone
Yes.
listening or anyone watching to go to don'tdefundmyschool.com and get involved in this fight, because the margin is razor thin in the Texas House. Every phone call, every email will matter. And we desperately need folks from all over the state of Texas to speak out on this bill, not just for the 5.5 million school children in Texas, but for the millions of school children around the country, because what happens in Texas oftentimes goes national. And if we can stop it here, we can stop it from hurting students across the country.
Now, is this a Texas specific website? Because I'm trying to find out what's happening in
Yes.
Brooklyn. Like, okay, so we gonna
Unfortunately,
need an
yeah,
we're,
unfortunately, this is the Texas specific website. That's where the most urgent fight is right now. But I would encourage folks in their states to get involved with their education organizations, with their local PTAs, their local teacher associations, retired teachers, and make sure that this doesn't happen in your state, because it will be coming to a school near you.